It was a chilly October morning when the intercom crackled to life, interrupting our mundane algebra class. The principal's voice, usually steady and composed, carried an uncharacteristic tremor as she announced, "Attention students and staff. This is not a drill. We are initiating a lockdown procedure. Please follow protocol and remain silent." A ripple of unease spread through the room. Mr. Thompson, our math teacher, immediately locked the door and drew the blinds. His face, normally calm and patient, was pale and tight-lipped. We huddled together in the corner, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering ominously. "Everyone stay quiet," Mr. Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible. "Turn off your phones. No light, no noise." I fumbled for my phone, switching it off with trembling fingers. The room was plunged into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building and the muffled sounds of footsteps in the hallway. My mind raced, conjuring worst-case scenarios. Was there a shooter? A dangerous intruder? I glanced at my friends, their faces mirrors of my own fear and confusion. We clung to each other, our breaths shallow and ragged. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The oppressive silence was punctuated by distant thuds and crashes, each one sending a jolt of terror through me. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give us away. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. We froze, eyes wide with panic. Mr. Thompson motioned for us to stay still. The rattling grew more insistent, then stopped. Whoever was out there moved on, their footsteps fading down the hall. A girl beside me, Lisa, started to cry silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. I reached out, squeezing her hand in a futile attempt to comfort her. My own fear was a tangible, choking presence in my throat. Time seemed to blur. It felt like hours had passed when in reality it had only been about 20 minutes. The intercom crackled again, and the principal's voice, now edged with desperation, said, "Remain where you are. Help is on the way." Help! The word barely registered through the fog of fear. I clung to it, though, a lifeline in the darkness. The noises outside grew louder, more chaotic. There were shouts, crashes, and a sound like glass shattering. My mind went numb with terror. I could see Mr. Thompson straining to listen, his face set in grim determination. Then, abruptly, there was silence. It was even more terrifying than the noise. We waited, every second a torment. My muscles ached from the tension, my eyes fixed on the door. Without warning, the silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. It was close. Too close. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle my own scream. The scream was followed by a guttural growl, inhuman and chilling. My blood ran cold. Mr. Thompson's eyes met mine, and I saw the same question in them. What was out there? The door shook violently, as if something massive was trying to break through. The doorknob twisted furiously, and the door itself seemed to bulge inward. Mr. Thompson positioned himself in front of us, a futile barrier between us and whatever was out there. The pounding stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was only the sound of our ragged breathing. Then, with a splintering crash, the door gave way. The sight that met my eyes was something out of a nightmare. A creature, tall and grotesque, stood in the doorway. It was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent light. It sniffed the air, a low growl rumbling from its throat. We were paralyzed with fear. The creature stepped into the room, its movements unnaturally fluid. It was closer now, and the stench of decay and blood was overpowering. Mr. Thompson moved, drawing the creature's attention. He shouted, trying to distract it, but it barely acknowledged him. It moved towards us, its eyes locked on our huddled group. Desperation gave me strength. I grabbed a heavy textbook, clutching it like a lifeline. The creature was almost upon us when a blinding light filled the room. The creature recoiled, screeching in pain. Through the light, I saw figures in tactical gear pouring into the room. They moved quickly, surrounding the creature and forcing it back. There were shouts, commands barked in a language I didn't understand, and then the creature was gone, dragged away by our mysterious saviors. The light faded, leaving us blinking and disoriented. One of the figures, a woman with a stern face, approached us. "You're safe now," she said, her voice firm. "We need to get you out of here." We stumbled to our feet, too shocked to resist. As we were led out of the school, I caught glimpses of the devastation left in the creature's wake. Classrooms were wrecked, blood smeared on the walls, and the bodies. I forced myself to look away, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Outside, the morning light seemed surreal, the normalcy of it jarring against the nightmare we had just survived. We were herded into waiting vans, and as I climbed in, I caught a glimpse of the school behind us. It looked like any ordinary building, but I knew better. As we drove away, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I clung to my friends, tears mingling with relief and lingering fear. We had survived, but I knew that the memory of that day would haunt me forever. In the days that followed, there were questions, investigations, and endless news reports. The official story was a gas leak, an explosion. But we knew the truth, even if no one else believed us. We had faced a nightmare, and though we had survived, the shadow of that day would remain with us, a reminder that the monsters in our nightmares could be all too real. The shrill wail of the school bell echoed through the hallways, signaling the end of fifth period. I packed up my history book, shoving it into my backpack. The chatter of my classmates filled the air as we all prepared to head to lunch. Just as I stood up, the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, students and staff. This is a lockdown. I repeat, this is a lockdown. Please follow lockdown procedures immediately." My heart skipped a beat. A lockdown? My mind raced, wondering if it was just a drill, but the tension in the air suggested otherwise. Mrs. Duncan, our teacher, quickly locked the door and switched off the lights, motioning for us to huddle in the corner away from the windows. The classroom, filled with the buzz of teenage energy moments ago, was now a silent cocoon of fear. We crouched in silence, our breaths shallow and synchronized. The only light came from the faint glow of our phones. Text messages from frantic parents and confused friends poured in, but none provided any real information. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in the oppressive silence. Then, we heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the deserted hallways. Slow and deliberate, the steps grew louder, closer. I glanced at my friend Jake, his wide eyes mirroring my own terror. Whoever was out there, they were getting nearer. A sudden bang shattered the silence, causing us to jump. It sounded like it came from the classroom next door. Muffled voices followed, then silence once more. My imagination ran wild with thoughts of what could be happening in that room. I prayed it was just the police, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps continued their methodical approach. Each step seemed to resonate with our collective fear, a slow countdown to an unknown doom. I clutched my phone tighter, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the raw fear etched on my classmates' faces. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. We all held our breath, eyes glued to the door. The knob twisted, but the lock held firm. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give us away. The rattling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I strained to hear anything, any clue as to what was happening outside our fragile sanctuary. Then, without warning, a loud metallic scraping sound filled the air. It was coming from above. I looked up, realizing with horror that someone was trying to get into the ventilation system. We stared at the ceiling, the scraping growing louder, more frantic. Mrs. Duncan gestured for us to stay calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The vents were old and flimsy. It wouldn't take much to break through. Just as suddenly as it started, the scraping stopped. We waited, the silence almost unbearable. Then the ceiling panel above the teacher's desk creaked, bending slightly. My heart was in my throat as a hand, pale and thin, reached through the gap. Mrs. Duncan grabbed a chair, ready to defend us. But before she could react, the panel gave way and a figure dropped into the room. He was tall and gaunt, with wild eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. He held a knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the dim light. We screamed, scrambling back, but there was nowhere to go. The intruder moved with a terrifying calmness, his eyes scanning the room as if deciding who to target first. Mrs. Duncan stepped forward, placing herself between us and the intruder. "Stay back!" she shouted, brandishing the chair. The man tilted his head, a grotesque smile spreading across his face. "You can't protect them," he whispered, his voice chillingly calm. Without warning, he lunged at her. The next moments were a blur of chaos and screams. Mrs. Duncan swung the chair, but he was too fast. He knocked it aside, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her against the wall. Her scream was cut short as he pressed the knife to her neck. "Quiet," he hissed, "or she dies." We fell silent, paralyzed by fear. He looked at us, his eyes glinting with a twisted satisfaction. "Now," he said, "we're going to play a little game." The next hour was a nightmare. He forced us to sit in a circle, taking turns answering his deranged questions. Any hesitation or wrong answer was met with a slap, a kick, or worse. Mrs. Duncan's bloodied face was a constant reminder of what awaited us if we didn't comply. Just when I thought all hope was lost, the sound of sirens filled the air. The intruder's smile faltered, replaced by a snarl of rage. He grabbed me by the hair, yanking me to my feet. "Come with me," he growled, dragging me towards the door. I struggled, but his grip was ironclad. The door burst open and a SWAT team flooded the room, their weapons trained on the intruder. "Drop the knife!" one of them shouted. The intruder hesitated, his grip on me tightening. For a moment, I thought he would kill me right there, but then he released me, dropping the knife and raising his hands. I stumbled back, my legs weak with relief. The officers tackled him to the ground, handcuffing him and dragging him out of the room. I collapsed into Jake's arms, sobbing with a mixture of terror and relief. The school was evacuated, and we were all taken to the gym, where our parents waited, their faces pale with worry. I ran into my mom's arms, the horror of the day finally hitting me full force. In the days that followed, the details emerged. The intruder was a former student, expelled years ago for violent behavior. He had returned, seeking revenge. Mrs. Duncan survived, though she would bear the physical and emotional scars for the rest of her life. As for me, I never saw school the same way again. The place that had once felt safe and familiar was now tainted by the memory of that horrifying day. The lockdown drill was no longer just a precaution. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of our safety and the darkness that could invade even the most ordinary of places. It started like any other day, with the usual chatter filling the hallways and students shuffling to their classes. I was sitting in Mrs. Ellison's history class, half listening to her drone on about the Industrial Revolution, when the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention students and staff, this is a lockdown. Please follow lockdown procedures immediately." My heart skipped a beat. We had drills for this, but there was always a nervous energy when it wasn't a drill. Mrs. Ellison's face turned pale as she hurriedly locked the door and motioned for us to move to the corner of the room, out of sight from the door's window. We all scrambled, trying to stay quiet, our eyes wide with fear and confusion. I squeezed in next to my best friends Jake and Sam. Jake tried to lighten the mood with a whispered joke, but it fell flat. No one was in the mood for humor. Mrs. Ellison turned off the lights and pulled the shades down. The room plunged into an eerie semi-darkness, the only light coming from the gaps around the windows. We sat in silence, the only sounds being our own breaths and the occasional muffled sob from someone across the room. I checked my phone, but there was no new information, just a flood of worried texts from my mom. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, we heard it. The unmistakable sound of gunshots, echoing down the hall. Panic set in, and some students started crying outright. Mrs. Ellison tried to shush us, but the fear was palpable, a living thing in the room with us. The shots grew louder, closer. I clung to Jake and Sam, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening, not here, not to us. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. We all froze, our eyes locked on the door. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. Mrs. Ellison positioned herself between us and the door, her face set in a mask of grim determination. The door burst open with a deafening crash. A masked figure stood in the doorway holding a gun. Time seemed to slow down. The figure scanned the room, then raised the weapon and fired. Mrs. Ellison crumpled to the ground, the sound of the gunshot ringing in our ears. Screams filled the room, but they were quickly drowned out by more gunshots. Chaos erupted as everyone tried to scatter, to find some place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The shooter moved methodically, firing again and again. I saw Jake go down, a look of shock on his face. Blood pooled around him, and my stomach churned. Sam grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the windows. We managed to pry one open and started climbing out just as more shots rang out behind us. We hit the ground running, the sounds of screams and gunfire fading as we put distance between us and the school. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the woods behind the football field. We collapsed, gasping for breath, our minds struggling to process what had just happened. Sam's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "We need to call for help," he said, his voice trembling. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos we'd just escaped. "There's been a shooting," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "People are hurt. Some are dead." The police arrived within minutes, but it felt like an eternity. We watched from our hiding spot as officers swarmed the building, their guns drawn. The sound of sirens filled the air, and I could see paramedics rushing into the school. We were found by a pair of officers who escorted us to safety, where we were checked for injuries and questioned about what had happened. The reality of it all hit me like a truck. Jake was dead. Mrs. Ellison was dead. And there were others too, whose faces I hadn't even registered in the chaos. The school was closed for weeks as the investigation continued. The shooter, a former student with a grudge, had been apprehended after a brief standoff with police. The media swarmed the town, turning our tragedy into a spectacle. But no amount of coverage could capture the raw, visceral horror of that day. I couldn't sleep for weeks, plagued by nightmares of the masked figure and the sound of gunshots. The image of Jake lying on the classroom floor haunted me, a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. Counseling helped, but it was a slow process. Sam and I leaned on each other, our shared trauma bonding us in ways we never imagined. The school eventually reopened, but it was never the same. The halls felt emptier, the laughter more subdued. We had a memorial for the victims, and I found some solace in the outpouring of support from the community. But the scars remained, both visible and invisible. I often think back to that day, to the moment the loudspeaker crackled to life and changed everything. It's a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how the mundane can turn into a nightmare in an instant. I carry the memories with me, a heavy burden, but also a testament to the resilience of those who survived. Life goes on, they say. But for those of us who were there, life is forever divided into before and after. And the echoes of that day, the last bell of normalcy, will always ring in our ears.